In front office football, many people enjoy setting the depth charts and maintaining the game plans when they simulate games. This is optional, but it is something that many people enjoy. In order to turn these functions on, you need to go to the Game Options menu, edit the single player option, and set these values to no. Coaches resetting the depth chart and resetting the game plan prior to each game. You can also turn the staff automatically signing player to fill the roster to no as well. This will make sure that you don't sign minimum wage players to fill your roster in the event of an injury. Some people need control over that as well if they want to maintain full control over their roster. So once you've done that, you can open the depth chart and game plans window from the menu, and this gives you all the game planning and depth chart screens. Now, this seems like a lot of them are repetitive. The depth chart functions are at the top, and you can control who plays in the backfield, and there's a basic first, second, third string quarterback, first and second string running backs, who goes in on third and short in passing downs when there's a near certain pass expected. That's usually your third and long. You set your tight ends similarly, your fullbacks if you have them, and your wide receivers, your flankers, your split ends who essentially act as the tight end on the other side of the formation, and your fifth receiver for that occasional 5-receiver format. Now on all of the depth chart and game planning screens, there's a recommend button. You can set these, and your staff will reset them just as they would prior to each game if you had the game options option turned on. You can also set your offensive line and special teams through this screen here. And again, I set the recommend. It'll set gunners as well, holders for kicks, but you're too deep at every position in the depth chart. Then you have a basic defense, and these are the 11 that come out in a regular 3-4 or 4-3. You can set your goal line defense, where you're going to bring in an extra defensive lineman. You can set your nickel defense, which is the choices that you make when you're set up in a nickel, so that you get an extra cornerback on the field to go up against usually a slot receiver. And you can see there's a nickel cornerback in this, and since I'm running a 4-3, there's one less linebacker. Your weak side linebacker comes off of the field for a 4-3. If I was using a 3-4 defense, then you would see just 3 linemen here. And as long as you can change any of these yourself, and when you change something in your depth chart, when you change your player, you can see that you get a basic overview of the scout impression of that player, as well as how experienced the player is at each position that he could possibly play. You can see Ninkovic is most experienced as a left defensive end, which is his primary position. And you can also set the dime defense, where you have another safety on the field, usually in deep coverage. You bring in this case, a defensive lineman comes off, a defensive tackle is replaced by a dime corner or safety, and recommend button works there as well. And you can also, if you really want to just save time, you can press this button, and it'll recommend all of the depth charts at once. And then when you look at those depth charts, you'll see all the players who were put in place to the recommend button. The next set of screens are used to control the game planning, and the main screen for game planning is your basic offensive game plan. And in this field, it looks a little complicated at first, but you'll get the hang of it quickly. What you'll see is the play calling for first down, second down, third down, and fourth down. Each has its own section. And then you have 1 yard to go, 2 yards to go, 3 yards to go, and so on. And so for whatever down and distance, you have 3 fields to set on this chart, and those must add to 100%. So in this case, if you have, let's say, second and 3 yards to go, 55% of the time you will call a run, 35% of the time you will call a short pass, and 10% of the time you will call a long pass. You can use the recommendation button here if you like as well. It will change it based on your upcoming opponent. And in this case, it looked like we're getting a little more long passing, a little bit running. So if you looked at your next opponent here, it would probably be a team that was a little bit better against the run. On defense, you have a similar basic defensive game plan, except in this case you have 4 fields to set for each. And here you have a basic run, a basic pass, and then an aggressive pass and an aggressive run for when you really want your players to commit to the play almost as the ball is snapped. So an aggressive run you would probably see more of your linebackers moving toward gaps right as the snap occurred. And if you're aggressive against the pass, they'll be dropping into pass coverage as early as they can. Those are the basics. Then you have your miscellaneous or your game plan adjustments. Now this is something that on offense you're controlling how often you go for it on 4th down. And in here you have the score and where the ball is on the field. And in these cases, now you're not going for it all the time in any of these situations. In fact, there are some situations where you will never go for it on 4th down unless you're at the end of the game and you are absolutely desperate to make a play. But this is where you control that. Now in this case, if you're trailing by 9 to 16 points and you're between the opponent's 21 and 50, it says you're going for it 80% of the time. This is modified based on your down or your distance to go. So if it's 4th and 1, yeah, you probably will go for it about 80% of the time here. But if it's 4th and 15, the game is going to use a little more common sense. These settings at the bottom tell you when you go to your hurry-up offense and when you go to your clock draining offense. You should probably leave these alone until you're more experienced with the game. There are also modifications to that affect formation usage. And front office football is a game that has a lot of formations. This controls how often you use each formation based on the expected running percentage. So an extreme passing situation would be when your game plan ranges from 0% to 9% run percentage. And then you can see you're going to use a lot of single back formation here. You could change this around and it will affect how plays are called during the game. Again, this is something that most people leave alone until they're really experienced with the game and they can see where they might be able to create matchup problems for other teams in certain situations. There are 6 of those screens. There are also personnel screens. Now these are something that you probably never will touch, but in these cases they control who plays when you're running, in this case, I formations. A normal I formation, you might want to change so that your second string flanker is always on the field in these situations. And then this here, when you have a run play in this formation, what percentage of the time it's a trap play or a reverse or some finesse run. Then you have miscellaneous offensive settings. These fine-tune your pass and run situations. For runs, this is where you control where your runs go. So in this case, you're running around the end 17% of the time. Now, with all of these screens, anytime you have something that adds to 100%, don't worry about doing the math. You just get it in generally where you like it, and the game will extrapolate that to 100% to make sure everything adds up correctly. These 3 control your short pass distance. So when you call a short pass, when your game plan calls for a short pass, how often is it going to be a screen or a really 0 to 4 yards from the line of scrimmage or 5 to 8 yards from the line of scrimmage. And similarly, you choose your long pass distance here. Here's where you choose how good your field goal kicker is essentially, where he's going to try to kick it from. And again, when you recommend it, the game will look at your field goal kicker's distance settings and choose appropriately. This chooses how often you run reverses or fullback runs, how often you keep your backs in to block, how often you keep your tight end to block. Um, Here you have your defensive personnel choices. This controls when you use different personnel based on where you are on the field, in the red zone or outside of the red zone, and whether you've called an aggressive run, pass, or an aggressive pass defense. This controls how often you blitz in these similar situations, whether first and second down, or some teams like to blitz a lot more on third down. And this controls how often you blitz multiple players. Usually you only blitz one player. But in certain situations, and some teams do it a lot of the time, especially when they're sending people aggressively against the pass, they want to get there quickly, so they will blitz a couple of players, or more even. Here's where you control pass coverage. The pass coverages, there are 8 different basic pass coverages in the game, and this controls how often these are used in extreme run situations or normal run situations, pass situations, etc. This controls where your top quarterback or your cornerback, whether they cover just the receiver on the same side of the field all the time, or they tune their defense toward the top wide receiver versus the second best wide receiver. Now, a lot of these things, again, you will never touch unless you're really good with the game. It gets very complex. You can also recommend an entire game plan, and it will tune that to your next opponent. As always, I would urge people to hit the F1 button on any screen to bring up the help file. Here, I'll give you an example here, and that will tell you a little bit more about what's going on that screen. You read these, you learn a lot more about the game, and most of your questions should be asked here, or answered here. So that's about all for the basics of game planning and depth charts. There's a lot to it, and again, most people don't get into most of these screens, but they're there if you want a little bit more out of front office football.